There is something Michael Jackson's children never knew about their own father. Not the music, not the moonwalk, not the version of him that the whole world had memorized by the time they were born. Something quieter than that. Something he carried every single day of his life and never once put down in front of them. He knew exactly who he was. And he spent their entire childhood making sure they never found out. That is the story most people have never heard. Not the masks, not the veils, not the hotel balcony or the white sheets or the circus of it all. Those things were visible. Those things were talked about on every television channel and laughed at on every late-night show and picked apart in every tabloid for 15 years. The real thing sat underneath all of that, quiet, hidden, passed down to 3 children who had no idea they were carrying it. And they are still carrying it now. To understand what Michael Jackson hid from his children, you first have to understand what had already been hidden from him. He was 5 years old when his father put him in front of an audience. 5 years old when the world started watching. By the time most children are learning to write their own name, Michael Jackson was already a product, already managed, already the most important financial asset his family had. His father, Joe Jackson, ran rehearsals the way a foreman runs a worksite. Long, punishing, without room for the kind of failure that normal childhood is built on. There are accounts from people who were inside that world, musicians, producers, people who watched the Jackson 5 rehearse and perform during those early years that describe a level of pressure on those children that was difficult to witness. Michael in particular. He was the most talented and therefore the most loaded, the most watched, the one whose mistakes cost the most and whose performances were expected to carry the most weight. He was a child doing the work of a professional and being held to the standard of one long before he had the years to justify it. Michael Jackson spoke about this in interviews for the rest of his life, not with self-pity exactly, with something more like bewilderment, like a man who kept returning to the same locked door, pressing his hand against it, unable to understand why it would never open. He said he watched other children play in parks from the window of a tour bus. He said he envied them in a way he could never fully explain. He said he felt like he had been borrowed from childhood rather than given one. That feeling never left him. It followed him through every decade of his life, through every reinvention, through every headline and every album and every controversy. Underneath all of it was a man who had been handed to the world before he was old enough to choose it, and who had spent the next 40 years trying to get back something that was already gone. Neverland Ranch was not an accident. It was not eccentric celebrity excess, though that is how most people chose to see it. It was a deliberate construction. A man building with money and land and architecture what he had not been allowed to have with time. Roller coasters and animals in a movie theater that ran films all day in a candy shop and a zoo. A place engineered piece by piece to look exactly like what childhood is supposed to look like. Not because Jackson had lost his mind, because he knew precisely what he had lost. And this was the closest he could get to building it back. He opened Neverland to other children too. Sick children, children from difficult circumstances. He brought them in and watched them experience the place, and by every account available, he was genuinely happiest in those moments. Not performing happiness, not producing content, just a man in a place he had built for a feeling he had never been allowed to feel, watching other people feel it, and finding something in that he could not find anywhere else. When he became a father, that loss became the architecture of everything. By 1996, Michael Jackson had already survived things that would have destroyed most people. The first wave of accusations, the settlement that the press treated as a confession regardless of what it legally was or was not, the exhausting, grinding collapse of his marriage to Lisa Marie Presley, a union the whole world had watched with fascination, and the end of which the whole world had opinions about. He was the most recognized person on earth, and also, in some ways, one of the most genuinely alone. The gap between how visible he was and how known he actually was had become one of the defining facts of his existence. He wanted children with an urgency that surprised even the people closest to him. Not as an accessory, not as a statement, not as the next chapter in a carefully managed public narrative. He wanted them the way someone wants water after a very long time without it. People who knew him said he talked about fatherhood like it was the one thing left that the world hadn't already taken from him and processed and sold back to him in a form he no longer recognized. And so he married Debbie Rowe. The story told publicly about that marriage was simple. A woman who cared deeply about Michael Jackson. A willing arrangement between two adults, a gift freely given by someone who wanted him to have the family he deserved. That version was not entirely wrong, but it left out almost everything that mattered. What his children were never told, what they had no framework to understand as small kids growing up inside the carefully controlled world their father had built, was how that world began. Prince and Paris were not born from a conventional marriage or a conventional relationship. The biological details of their conception have never been fully confirmed in any public record. Debbie Rowe's own accounts of what happened shifted significantly over the years, sometimes contradicting each other so directly that it became impossible to know which version she herself believed to be true. In one widely reported interview, she described her children in terms that sounded less like a mother and more like someone describing a gift they had arranged for someone else. She said she had given them to Michael because she believed he deserved to be a father, that having children for him was simply something she could do for a person she cared about. That is a strange thing for a mother to say, and it planted a question that has never been fully answered. His children grew up with a name for their mother, a face, a person they could point to if someone asked. What they did not have was the truth underneath that name. Whether the man who raised them was their biological father, whether the woman who carried them had the relationship to them that the word mother implies. Those questions were buried before his children were old enough to ask them, and Jackson made sure the burial was deep and the ground above it was level. This was not cruelty. Everything else about how he raised his children points away from cruelty, but it was control. The same control he applied to every part of his public life extended now to the private one. His children's sense of where they came from would be managed the same way his image had always been managed, carefully, on terms he set, without room for ambiguity that he had not approved. The question of their origin was the first thing he hid from them. It would not come close to being the last. Here is something that does not get talked about enough. Michael Jackson was not simply protecting his children from a cruel world in the abstract. He was protecting them from a specific question, a question that was being asked about them every single day, in newspapers and on television and in the comment sections that were just beginning to define public conversation from the moment they were born. Are they really his? His children were visibly light-skinned. Paris had blue eyes. Prince had features that did not match the image the public carried of their father, and the world, which had spent 3 decades watching Michael Jackson's own appearance change so completely that it barely resembled the child he had been, was obsessed with this fact. They debated it openly. They ran photographs side by side in magazines and asked readers to draw their own conclusions. Tabloids published DNA speculation the way other publications print weather forecasts. Talk show hosts made jokes that millions of people laughed at in living rooms across the country without pausing to think about the 3 kids those jokes were actually about or what it would mean for them to one day hear them. Jackson knew all of this was happening. He was not naive about the coverage. He had spent his entire adult life inside it, reading it, responding to it, being shaped by it in ways he probably did not fully understand himself. He knew exactly what the world was saying about his children. He made a decision that was, in its own way, completely understandable. His children would not know, not yet. Maybe not ever, if he could manage it long enough. The television in his home was managed. The internet access was managed. Who his children spoke to, what those people were allowed to say, which parts of the outside world were permitted to reach them, and in what form all of it was managed. He was going to hold the noise back for as long as he could, until his children were old enough and solid enough in themselves to survive it. The problem was that holding noise back is not the same thing as making children ready for it. There's a difference between a child who has never heard something difficult and a child who has heard it and been helped to understand it. The first child is protected. The second child is prepared. Jackson chose protection every single time. And protection, when it lasts long enough and is complete enough, starts to look a lot like a wall with no door. When Paris Jackson eventually stepped out into the world as a teenager, after her father was gone and the people managing the walls were gone with him, she did not step out prepared. She stepped out into the full volume of everything that had been waiting for her. Every debate, every accusation, every joke. Every tabloid theory about who she really was and where she really came from. All of it at once, without warning, without context, without the one person who could have helped her understand any of it standing beside her. She has described that experience in interviews with a steadiness that is more heartbreaking than any anger would be. She said it felt like a collision, like 2 realities, the one she had been raised inside and the one that had existed parallel to it all along, finally hitting each other at full speed. She was not ready. She has said so herself, plainly, without self-pity. She was simply not ready. Her father had protected her from the noise. He had not protected her from the collision. The version of Michael Jackson that his children knew was real. This needs to be said clearly because it gets buried under everything else every single time the story gets told. He was the man who could not wait for Christmas morning, who woke his children before dawn because his own excitement was too large to contain until a reasonable hour. He was the man who built Neverland, not for the cameras. The cameras were almost never invited in, but because he believed with complete sincerity that childhood deserved to look like that. Rides and animals and a movie theater that smelled like popcorn at 10 in the morning. He kept candy in his pockets. He read to his children at night when he was home. He called their tutors personally to check on what they were learning and how they were doing. He was present in the way that very few people who carry the weight he carried ever managed to be present. The people who observed him with his children say this consistently enough, across enough different sources, that it cannot be reasonably dismissed. Whatever else Michael Jackson was, he was that. But his children only ever had access to that version of him. The other version, the one the world had been debating and dissecting and arguing over for 20 years before his death, was locked entirely outside the walls of their life. They did not know the details of what he had been accused of. They did not know the names. They did not sit with him through the 2005 trial, did not understand what it meant, did not have any framework for what their father had been put through or what the central questions of that trial actually were. The accusations, the testimony, the years of coverage, the public verdict and the legal one, and the difference between them, none of it had been allowed to reach them. Jackson had a certainty about this that was almost stubborn in its completeness. If he could control the environment tightly enough, for long enough, it would not matter. The world could think whatever it wanted. Inside his walls, his children would know only what he chose to give them, and what he chose to give them was a father who loved them, a childhood that looked like the one he had always wanted, a world small enough to be safe. What he kept from them was himself, the complicated, fully human, deeply contested version of himself that the rest of the world had been arguing about for decades. He gave them the father. He withheld the man. And those are not the same thing. That is perhaps the most profound thing he hid from his children, not the accusations specifically, not the legal history or the trial or the questions that will probably never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. He hid the full picture of who he was. He gave them love without context. And when he was gone, they were left holding that love with nowhere to put the questions that came with it. There is one more thing he kept from them, and it is the one that almost never gets mentioned alongside everything else. Michael Jackson died with an estate valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. He also died with debts that, depending on which accounting you consulted, came close to matching or exceeding that figure. The structure of his finances was complex in ways that took teams of lawyers and accountants years to fully untangle after his death. There were loans taken against his music catalog, including his share of the Sony ATV catalog that contained some of the most valuable publishing rights in the history of recorded music. There were mortgages on Neverland and arrangements with lenders that had been restructured multiple times. There were business dealings so layered that even people inside his inner circle, people who had worked closely with him for years, did not fully understand the complete picture. His children knew none of this. They were 12, 11, and 7 years old when he died. You do not explain debt structures and catalog rights and licensing agreements and the mechanics of a fortune that is simultaneously enormous and structurally fragile to children those ages. That is not a failure that belongs only to Michael Jackson. Most parents do not explain their finances to young children, and most parents are right not to. But Jackson's finances were not most parents' finances. And the situation his children stepped into after his death was not a situation most children ever have to navigate. When he died in June of 2009, his children inherited not just his memory and his music, and the complicated emotional weight of his legacy. They inherited a legal and financial structure of breathtaking complexity that was immediately contested by multiple parties with competing interests. Executors were appointed. Trusts were established and challenged. Decisions began to be made about their father's name, his image, his music, his likeness, the use of his voice, the rights to his performances. Decisions made by adults they had never met, in rooms they had never entered, about assets they had never been told existed, with consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. His children had no preparation for any of it, not because Jackson was negligent, but because he had kept them so completely outside his actual world, the world of business and money and power, and the machinery of his own fame, that when that world was handed to them, they were holding something they had never once been allowed to touch. The problem was not that they did not know the numbers. The problem was that they did not know the values. What their father had believed was worth protecting, what he would have fought for, and what he would have let go. The things that mattered most to him about his legacy, and the things he would have traded without hesitation. That knowledge, the knowledge that only comes from being inside someone's actual life rather than the version of it they construct for your benefit, was exactly what they did not have. Because they had never been inside his actual life. They had been inside the version he built for them. Paris Jackson is in her late 20s now. She makes music. She speaks openly about things her father never could have spoken openly about. Her mental health, her identity, the years after his death, when everything she thought she understood had to be examined and rebuilt piece by piece. She has spoken about a suicide attempt as a teenager. She has spoken about therapy and recovery and the long work of figuring out who she is outside the mythology she was born into. She has talked about her father with a care and a steadiness that is remarkable, given everything she inherited along with his name. She believes he was a good man. She says this directly and without apology. She is also aware, with full clarity, that the rest of the world does not simply agree with that assessment and never will. She grew up inside a version of reality that was built specifically to be separate from the one everyone else was living in. And the work of her adult life has been, in large part, the work of figuring out which parts of what she was given were true, which parts were protection, which parts were something in between, and how to carry all of it without being carried by it. Prince Jackson has been measured in public. Careful. He does not rage against the coverage of his father, and he does not amplify it. He graduated from university, has worked in film and in philanthropy, and occupies a space in public life that looks, from the outside, like someone who has made a genuine peace with not being able to control a narrative. That peace, if that is what it is, represents perhaps the most significant departure from his father's entire approach to the world. Michael Jackson could never make that peace. It was not available to him. That his eldest son appears to have found it is either a tribute to how well he was raised or evidence of how different the son is from the father. Probably both. Bigi, the youngest, has remained almost entirely private. He gave one interview years ago, remarkable, mostly for its brevity and for how carefully it said almost nothing. He appears to be building a life that his father would have recognized in structure, defined by chosen distance from public attention, but different in the most important way. For Bigi, the privacy is a choice. For his father, it was always ultimately a construction. Michael Jackson was never actually private. He was only ever protected. There is a difference, and it is the difference between a wall you built and a wall you live inside without having chosen it. All three of his children are doing, each in their own way, the thing their father spent his entire life trying to prevent from happening to them. They are living in the open. Now here is the part that most people skip over when they tell this story. Michael Jackson was not a man who hid things from his children because he was ashamed of them or because he was a calculating deceiver who wanted to manipulate the people who trusted him most. That framing is too simple, and it gets the emotional truth exactly wrong. He was terrified. Terrified of a specific thing, the thing that had been done to him. He had been known before he was a person. He had been public property before he had a self to call his own. His father had handed him to the world before he was old enough to refuse the exchange or understand what he was giving up, and the world had taken everything on offer and never once given any of it back. His face belonged to strangers. His grief showed up in headlines. His body and his appearance and every change he made to himself over 30 years of life was public record, publicly debated, publicly owned by people who had never met him and never would, but who felt with complete confidence that they had the right to an opinion about it. He was 50 years old, and he could not walk into a grocery store without being surrounded. He was 50 years old and somewhere on Earth, every single day without a single exception. His name was being said in a conversation he had no access to and no ability to shape. He was 50 years old, and he had never, not once in his entire adult life, found a way to simply exist without an audience watching and forming judgments and deciding who he was. And so, when his children were born, the thing he decided to give them was the only thing he had ever truly wanted for himself and never been able to have. Time. Time to exist without being known. Time to become someone before the world got to decide who they were. Time to be unremarkable, anonymous, free, to have a childhood that belonged to them and only to them, in a way that his had never belonged to him from the moment his father put him on a stage at 5 years old. The masks were not shame. The secrecy was not guilt. The veils and the covered faces and the carefully managed exposure and the walls around Neverland and the tutors instead of schools and all of it, every single piece of it, was not at its core about hiding anything dark or keeping any terrible secret buried. It was about time. About a man who understood, better than almost anyone alive, what it costs a child to grow up without privacy, who had paid that cost himself in full over 40 years, and who was determined, with everything he had, to make sure his children never had to. The tragedy is that it did not work, not because the instinct was wrong. The instinct was not wrong. Because time bought inside sealed walls does not prepare you for the moment the walls open. It only makes the opening louder and the ground outside less familiar. His children came out into a world that had been talking about them and about their father and about everything their father may or may not have been for their entire lives. And they had to learn all of it at once, without preparation, without a guide, without the one person who could have stood beside them and said, "Here is what is true and here is what is not, and here is how to hold all of it without letting it hold you." There is one more thing worth saying before this story ends. His children are not defined by what was kept from them. They are not broken by it, though it clearly cost them in ways that are still unfolding. Paris and Prince and Biggie are adults now, building real lives, making real choices, carrying a mythology that would flatten most people and choosing, each of them in their own way, not to be flattened by it. But there is something in the specific shape of what Michael Jackson hid from his children, the origins he buried, the world he blocked out, the version of himself he withheld, the financial reality he never let them touch. And, underneath all of it, the simple fact of a man who was afraid of what the world would do to the people he loved most. There is something in all of that worth sitting with, for longer than most people do. Because none of it was careless, none of it was random. Every secret, every managed boundary, every carefully constructed wall around their childhood was the product of a man who had looked at the world with clear eyes and made a precise and deliberate judgment about what it would cost his children if he let it in. He built the masks. He built the veils. He He built Neverland in the rules and the silence and the tutors and the covered faces and hotel corridors and the entire careful architecture of a childhood the world could not reach. And then he died. And the world reached in anyway. What his children have done since then, quietly and imperfectly and each in their own way, is something he could not have scripted and could not have controlled and could not probably have fully predicted. They grew up anyway. They came out anyway. They are, despite everything, still here. Michael Jackson spent his entire life trying to control the image. What he left behind, in the three people he loved the most, was something he never quite managed to control at all, something real.